The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Men die from suicide 3 times more frequently than women, and the U.S. rate is highest among white middle-aged men. Psychologists tell us that while there are many factors, it reflects the harm of clinging to a mummified version of what it means, or what it used to mean, to be a man, what's sometimes referred to as toxic or brittle masculinity. There's compelling evidence that masking weakness as strength is a key ingredient in the rise of national strongmen, who ultimately drag their countries with them when they fail. That then is the topic of this week's edition of Challenge 2.0, when strongmen aren't. Our guest today wrote a remarkable book simply titled Strongmen. I will be the first to admit that it kept me up at night. It's riveting, revealing, and disturbing in its very important insights. Author Ruth Ben-Ghiat is professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, the recipient of numerous fellowships, and a sought-after commentator for the Washington Post, CNN, and PBS. Thank you so much for setting aside some time to talk with us today, Professor.
Glad to be talking with you.
Let's begin with the title, and that is Strongmen. How do you define a strongman?
So for the purposes of my book and my work, strongmen are authoritarian leaders who either destroy democracy or damage democracy, like Berlusconi in Italy, who had a kind of executive, strong authoritarian style, even though he didn't wreck democracy. But they're also men who use masculinity and virility as one of their tools of rule, alongside corruption, propaganda, and violence. So the masculinity is part of what, and the use of their body in a certain way is what makes them strong men.
As you were drawn to the study of history as a historian, what particularly drew you to the study of strong men and their phenomenon in world and within their own nation's history?
I started out studying Italian fascism, and I grew up in Southern California in a very beautiful, small, seaside town. And it had been a place where a lot of exiles from Nazism had come, way before my time. But I knew about them, and some of their kids and grandkids were, around, and I got very curious about what it meant to have these destructive leaders who forced people to flee, going all the way from Berlin to Los Angeles. And then I decided to focus on Italian fascism. And when I started to do this book much more recently, it was because there's a new crop of strongmen leaders, and authoritarianism is on the ascent. And I felt it was time to take a look, over 100 years at this phenomenon.
In reading your book, you refer, Professor, to a pattern that's been repeated around the world, as you referenced, something called an authoritarian playbook.
The basic tools of rule that these leaders use, the propaganda, which includes kind of personality cults and masculinity and corruption. And it's not just financial corruption, but also getting people to collaborate with them like elites. And of course, violence. How does this change over 100 years, and what stays the same and what changes? And they all work together. So for example, the personality cult, and this was amazing because the rules of the personality cult haven't actually changed for 100 years. The leader has to be an everyman, a man of the people, but he also has to be a superman, a man who's above all other men, and a man who gets away with things that ordinary men cannot. So there you connect to corruption, because getting away with crime is the essence of authoritarianism. So the book looks at how these tools interact, like propaganda and violence as well. And so the reader can see for propaganda, for example, what is the same and what has changed over 100 years.
So I would have to ask, as I was reading your book, I had numerous aha moments where all of a sudden the pattern that you drew made perfect sense. As you were doing this initial research, did it strike you that how that all was falling together and explained things that perhaps we didn't perceive before that time?
It did. I was one of the main things I was surprised to see is how there are these patterns that recur, and one of them is why people fall for these men who are serial liars and assaulters, and many of them were actually criminals when they came into power. Both Mussolini and Hitler had criminal records, or they come in via coups, so they're doing something illegal, or Putin and Berlusconi and Donald Trump were under investigation when they ran for office. So these patterns are very interesting. And so one of the things I found, which was relevant for America in 2016 and so many other times, is that when a society has had a lot of social change, quick change, and it could be, changes in gender relations, racial equity, workers' rights, and these are changes that some people feel are overdue, and they're overjoyed about them. And other people feel like their status is threatened. And so in Europe and America, it's been white males who feel their authority in society is diminishing. And it says it's at those times when there's a lot of change, it also could be secularization, that people go for these men appear on the scene, and it's then that they have an appeal. And so on the one hand, they're going to kind of shake everything up because they communicate in original ways and they do things differently. And as I said, they're kind of outlaw figures. But on the other hand, they're going to turn the clock back and they're going to make everything orderly again. And so this happens over and over again, from just after World War I, when you have fascism come, to America in 2016, where many people had never accepted 8 years of Barack Obama, an African-American president. They didn't accept legalization of same-sex marriage. And there were all these changes that seemed too much for many people.
Had this groundwork been laid some decades before?
I think so. I think that certainly if we look at the Republican Party, which partnered with Donald Trump, they had been going through their own evolution of becoming more radical, more right-wing, also the influence of the Tea Party, and really had already started to abandon some of the customs of bipartisanship, such as recognizing that you can have a political opponent that has different ideas from you, but you don't have to call for them to be locked up.
In my memory, things like sexual abuse and harassment, you mentioned corruption, instead of being a disqualifying aspect for these candidates, these people, it almost seemed to be a source of celebration among some of their supporters. Is that a valid perception? And if so, what are your insights on that?
It is valid. And one of the reasons I made I have a whole chapter on virility and masculinity is that I learned a lot from political scientists writing this book about corruption and the nature of political systems. But political scientists don't really analyze masculinity and these kinds of the body politics. And instead, they're very, very important, because what you see in the kind of cohort, the generation of strongmen, that's many of them are still in power, from Duterte in the Philippines to Bolsonaro. When they come on the scene, they challenge and they test boundaries by talking about either very aggressively about abusing women, or being very homophobic, or promising violence. And so I was already tracking this. And then Trump came on the scene. And in January 2016, as a political candidate, he gave a speech and he said, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and I wouldn't lose any followers. And my hair stood on end as a historian of fascism, because nobody who's in a democratic with a small d framework as a political candidate would ever do that. But authoritarians, people who have an intention to be outlaws, to be rogues, they would do that. And this is why, and this kind of rogue personality was very compelling. And here we go back to the man above all other men, the man who gets away with things ordinary men cannot. And so both men and women look up to these figures. And this is why when the Access Hollywood tapes came out during the presidential campaign, and Trump talked about, grabbing women's private parts and all of this, many people thought he would be finished.
Mhm.
And had he been a candidate in the conventional presidential mode of either party, he would have been finished. But he was an authoritarian style candidate. And so it actually added to his glamour for some people. And this I foresaw, and I was extremely upset that I was right.
While many women expressed their distaste, they found this behavior absolutely abhorrent. Others not only overlooked it, but they seemed to also welcome that. How do you explain that? What is your perception of that?
This is something that's one of the patterns that recurs. And in fact, women have always been one of the solid bases of support for authoritarians in Russia, or even in Brazil. And these are places where the ruler is not only openly sexist and misogynistic, but takes women's rights away often, or defines who can be a family very, strictly, let's say. And so it depends on the situation. But for example, if we look back at the template provided by fascism and Nazism, women actually, if you were among the included, because what these rulers do is that they say they're going to make the nation great, and they're very good at getting a sense of giving people a sense of community. So for example, women who were considered Aryans in Nazi Germany had far more status than men who were not Aryan. And so women felt that they were elevated by Nazism. And this kind of dynamic where they feel that they are superior to men who are state enemies, or to people of color of either sex, this is very powerful. And it explains things that may not seem logical to us if we approach this through a democratic framework.
You not only drew parallels or examples in the United States, but also how this was being displayed by leaders of certain other countries. Could you maybe share some of those similarities that you found?
So the body of the male leader in this, and this is what makes the strongmen different than other kinds of leaders. And not all authoritarians are strongmen leaders. So for example, Mussolini was the first. He was very, very important, and he's not well known enough. Hitler, for very good reasons, gets more attention. Mussolini kind of laid down the template in the 1920s for what a strongman could be. And he was a performer, and he used to strip his shirt off. And he had, he would ski shirtless in the winter. He would pose in skimpy bathing suits in the summer. And his body became an emblem of the nation. And so this is a difference where democratic leaders with a small d, they represent the nation. But strongmen, they embody the nation. And so their bodies become like symbols of the nation. So Mussolini starts this off with this kind of body display. And the other person, the other bookend is Putin, who does the same thing. He's constantly stripping his shirt off. And so you have Mussolini and Putin, who both, there were many Mussolinis and there's many Putins. So, Putin releases these state-approved calendars every year, and there's a Putin for every month. There's Putin sniffing a flower. There's Putin, with heavy machinery, kind of being a dominator. There's Putin in military uniform. There's all kinds of Putins for every mood. And this is part of this using your body and your persona as performance, and it's part of the personality cult. And so when we get to contemporary leaders, Putin's really the only one who does this with regularity. Now, Trump did something interesting, and I didn't include it in the book, the image, but he doesn't take his shirt off, but he borrowed Sylvester Stallone's body. In 2019, he tweeted, and it wasn't a retweet, somebody in his entourage photoshopped his head onto Sylvester Stallone's body, which is a naked torso, in Rocky III. And he put it out there as a kind of fantasy of what he could stand for, as strength, as the tough guy. And so one of the talents that these men have for 100 years is that they will be whatever you want them to be. And they become like a repository of fantasies.
As we discuss some of the aspects of corruption, cronyism, sexual misbehavior, it would seem that that would divide them from traditional faith communities. And yet, while that's the case with some, it's not with all of them. Have you found parallels for that? And what's your interpretation for that?
This is a very interesting issue that all of these men, they have success because they are able to co-opt, and that's the official term, co-optation, all kinds of elites, financial elites, but religious elites are very important for them because it gives them a moral legitimacy. And over you find that important religious institutions proclaim these leaders as in office by divine will. And they become the only men who can know how to put the nation into a better state of greatness because they have a kind of divine prognostication skill. Sometimes it's the most profane, non-pious people who are the best at making these kind of deals with religious institutions. So Mussolini, he had been a socialist in his youth, and he was an atheist. Not just any atheist, the biggest atheist you could be, very anti-clerical, a serial rapist, thief, everything. So not somebody who has high moral standards, shall we say. And yet he was the one who made peace with the Vatican and created the independent Vatican City. And when we get on the other end of time up to the present, it's very interesting that somebody like Donald Trump, who doesn't have a pious past, was embraced by both evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews. And he delivered very well for both these groups. So here we have the opportunism of these men. And just as I said before, they will be whoever you need them to be. They will also make alliances with anybody because they don't have any principles. They don't have any moral scruples. They will do what's best for power holding. And so they actually can be very effective in a transactional way, and religious institutions have often benefited.
When we look at some of the demonstrations, some of the rallies, certainly the January 6th insurrection, we see not only older white men, but we also see very young men, typically white, that are very supportive of these strongmen tactics. What does that indicate to you about the environment and the upbringing of these young men? And is there ultimately a long-term cost to those same people?
It's hard to generalize about upbringings and environment, but what we can say is often these these leaders have an appeal when there's a sense of a crisis of masculinity.
Right.
And certainly after World War I, that was the paradigmatic case. You had so many disabled men, you had men who had disaster after World War I in terms of masculinity. And this is when Hitler and Mussolini came up and promised to kind of save the nation and became these kind of idols. So you do see this dynamic that repeats, that it's when there are periods when men feel threatened. It could be by female equality. It could be white men threatened by men of color getting power, demographic change. And they fear that they're losing status as individuals, and also as, if they're racists, as members of their race. So they go for these kinds of leaders whose violence and risk-taking makes them feel excited. And this, one of the very sad things that I cover in my corruption chapter, which really it's important that this what I wrote about in the corruption chapter was kind of moral corruption. How do people come to make peace with collaborating and working with and doing violent things for these strong men? and you see how people change. They become kind of intoxicated, and they feel that they have more status, and they feel liberated sometimes at being able to do things they wouldn't have dreamed anybody would let them do. And of course, it's very destructive. Ultimately, it's a very, very destructive dynamic.
So as we look, Professor, where we're at now, where we've moved since the last election, what are important lessons for us to draw from this in terms of how we view ourselves, how we move forward in action, and how we relate to each other?
I think that when you have episodes like this in a culture, and often they end very badly, because the strongman is a destructive figure, and he sometimes he begins to believe his own propaganda, and he's violent by nature. He drags the culture down. It's a time to look in the mirror and ask yourself collectively as a society, what was it about this person that was so appealing? And what we find, and many people don't like to do this confrontation with the national mirror, is that these men reveal that there were things that are aspirational for a society. So, for example, Donald Trump seemed like a successful businessman. He seemed glamorous. He seemed like he had only beautiful women that looked a certain way. And ultimately, strongman is also a reflection on this model of power that we kind of fetishize, the strong man who can tell everybody what to do. And is this indeed a healthy model of power? I think not. So it's very interesting to read, as I did in the last chapter, which is about how they fall, these reflections that people make in 1945 Italy or in 1990 Chile, reflections about how did we get into this mess and what does it say about us as a nation?
So when we look at the possibility of making a course correction in this country, we've had a change in administration, a change in direction at this point. Are you optimistic? Do you think we're capable of making that course correction, or do you think there are further lessons we're going to need to learn the hard way?
A little of both. I think that I've been very pleased as somebody who works on democracies being destroyed, that the Biden administration has talked so much about the struggle for democracy and the stakes of democracy versus autocracy. I also think that it's very interesting. I didn't have expectations of Biden in this or any other area, but he has modeled a kind of anti-strongman personality where he is tough. He calls Putin a killer, so he's anti-autocrat. That's very important. But he also shows empathy. And many of the things that the government is doing are designed to restore trust in government. It's still early to see what will happen, but there are hopeful signs that certainly that key figures in that administration have understood that a different model of leadership is needed. On the other hand, January 6th is a very, very serious radicalization moment for the GOP. And we are in a situation where it's rather unique in history, where you have a bipartisan system and one of the two parties is not interested in democracy anymore. It is moving toward autocracy. And how we resolve that, I am not sure at this point.
The other issue I'd ask you as an educator as well as a researcher is we've read where some of the states are looking at rewriting history to basically set aside the sorrier aspects of their history. What's your response to that? And what do you think we need to do within our education system to avoid people being as easily moved by the appeals of a strongman figure?
I think certainly in America in particular, because we've never had a national dictatorship, we've never had foreign occupation, we were able to take democracy for granted, even as we didn't fully come to terms with the anti-democratic and authoritarian structural things in our own country, inside our own country, whether with Native Americans or the history of African Americans. It was certainly dispiriting to see that there was attempts at censoring rewritings of history to make the experiences of slavery more central. There's a lot of, that's very threatening to a certain kind of power structure. And in history, when you have strongmen figures, they always try to rewrite history, promoting certain easy patriotism, and they always try to suppress other kinds of histories being written.
Well, Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, we thank you very much for your time today. We would mention we're going to be posting, you've probably seen it already to our viewers out there, your website, and also you do a newsletter as well for people interested in continuing to follow this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I might mention that we're going to follow this discussion next week with an exploration of what's called gender reconciliation, a conversation with experts on how men and women can heal and grow their relationships, and in the process, help others heal and grow as well. Thank you again for joining us for this episode of Challenge 2.0.
If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought-provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.